So what do you guys think of the Stones coming and playing the Enmore Theatre?
It's great. They're playing in our backyard.
Yeah.
Angus Young. The name itself is pure rock and roll. For over 50 years, the guy in the schoolboy uniform has been the electrifying, duck-walking heart of AC/DC, a band that has never once compromised, followed a trend, or turned down the volume. His guitar playing is a force of nature, raw, relentless, and you know it the second you hear it. But his unfiltered tongue? That's just as sharp as his riffs. Angus built a legacy on a simple, almost brutal philosophy: rock and roll should be pure, powerful, and get straight to the point. He has no time for pretension, no patience for theatrics that overshadow the music, and absolutely no tolerance for bands he feels have lost their way. Now, after more than 5 decades in the business, you might see stuff online about Angus Young's hate list. Let's be real, Angus hasn't sat down and dictated a list of bands he despises. That's just not his style. But what he has done, across countless interviews from the gritty pub rock days of the 70s to global stadium tours, is leave a trail of legendary, unfiltered, and often brutally honest takes on some of music's biggest names. These aren't just casual insults, they're declarations of his unwavering musical beliefs. So today, we're not running with some fake list. We're doing something way better. We're digging through the archives to uncover the 6 legendary bands that have found themselves on the receiving end of Angus Young's most pointed critiques. We'll get into the shocking personal stories, the direct and often hilarious quotes, and the fundamental clashes in rock and roll philosophy that put them in Angus's crosshairs. This is the story of a rock and roll purist, a man who knows what he likes and has never, ever been afraid to say what he thinks. To really get Angus Young's take on the Rolling Stones, you have to understand his deep respect for the roots of rock and roll. For Angus, the Stones weren't just another band, they were, at one time, the gold standard. Along with legends like Chuck Berry, they were the architects of the sound that made AC/DC even possible. The raw, bluesy, swaggering energy of early Stones records like Jumpin' Jack Flash was, in Angus's eyes, the absolute peak of rock perfection. It was dangerous, it was real, and it didn't apologize for it, but as the 1970s rolled on, the Rolling Stones started to change. They embraced new sounds, mixing in bits of disco, funk, and soul. Albums like Black and Blue and Some Girls showed them experimenting, a move that critics and a lot of fans praised. Angus Young was not one of them. He didn't see it as progress. He saw it as a betrayal of who they were. In a now famous 1977 interview, a young, fiery Angus didn't pull any punches. He felt the Stones were guilty of the biggest sin in rock: they weren't playing rock and roll anymore. The Rolling Stones get up and play soul music these days, he said flatly. This is supposed to be rock and roll. This wasn't just a cheap shot, it was a criticism from a true believer. For Angus, rock music had a sacred energy. It was about the driving guitar, the pounding beat, and a raw, primal connection. He felt the Stones were watering down that powerful formula. His critique went even deeper, hitting on authenticity. Leave that to the people who do it best, the black people, he continued, arguing that by chasing trends, the Stones were stepping into territory that wasn't really theirs. In his view, a band's strength came from knowing who you are and sticking to it. By trying to be everything to everyone, he believed the Stones were losing the very thing that made them great. If the Stones played what they do best, they'd be a hell of a lot better, he finished. He called it straying too far from home, a simple but heavy slam against a band he felt had lost its way. This clash really highlights a deep divide in music philosophy. The Rolling Stones have always been musical chameleons, adapting to stay relevant. AC/DC, on the other hand, is a monolith. They found their sound early and have spent 50 years perfecting it, not changing it. As Angus once famously joked, "I'm sick to death of people saying we've made 11 albums that sound exactly the same." In fact, we've made 12 albums that sound exactly the same. He sees that consistency not as a weakness, but as the ultimate strength. However, the story doesn't end there. Over the decades, any feud has pretty much melted into mutual respect. In 2003, AC/DC actually opened for the Rolling Stones on their Licks tour, where Angus and his brother Malcolm even joined the Stones on stage for a killer version of the blues classic Rock Me Baby. Angus later mentioned how welcoming Keith Richards was. In a final, touching twist, Angus revealed that in his brother Malcolm's final days battling dementia, one of the last records he played for him was the Stones' 2016 blues cover album, Blue and Lonesome, saying Malcolm just thought it was great. It was a quiet acknowledgement that, when all was said and done, the blues-drenched rock that inspired them both was a bond that couldn't be broken. If one band defined the colossal, godlike status of 1970s rock, it was Led Zeppelin. They were a monster, selling out stadiums, topping charts, and pushing the limits of what a rock band could be. Their music was a complex mix of heavy blues, folk, mythology, and mind-blowing musicianship. For millions, a Led Zeppelin concert was a 3-hour epic journey. Angus Young went to one of those shows and, to put it lightly, he wasn't impressed. In fact, he was bored. Angus's problem with Led Zeppelin gets to the heart of a split that was happening in rock music at the time, the fight between ambitious, progressive rock and raw, high-energy rock. AC/DC was all about raw energy. Their shows were brutally efficient, a non-stop assault of high-voltage rock designed to grab you by the throat and not let go. There were no flute solos, no 15-minute drum odysseys. It was all killer, no filler. So when Angus saw the sprawling, multi-hour Zeppelin show, he didn't see it as artistic genius, but as a total waste of time. I've seen that band live. They were on for 3 hours. For 2.5 hours, they bored the audience, he said with his usual bluntness. This is a shocking thing to say, since Zeppelin's live shows are legendary. But Angus looked past the myth and focused on one thing, the audience's energy. He watched the crowd lose steam during the long, wandering instrumentals, but what really got him was the ending. Then at the end they pull out old rock and roll numbers to get the crowd moving. That's sick, he declared. In his mind, that was a cheap trick. It was like they were admitting their own fancy material couldn't keep the energy up, so they had to fall back on the simple rock and roll classics they'd supposedly moved beyond. To Angus, that was just dishonest. They're supposed to be the most exciting rock and roll band in the world, he said, and you can feel the disappointment in his words that he even called them poor imitators of The Who, suggesting their attempts at epic rock weren't as good as what The Who had already done. This wasn't about jealousy, it was about a purist's frustration. Angus respected musicianship, he knew Jimmy Page was an incredible talent, but he believed it should always serve one goal, to excite the audience. He saw Zeppelin's shows as self-indulgent, putting musical complexity over raw impact. It was the total opposite of the AC/DC way, which was simple: if you're not making the crowd sweat and scream from the first note to the last, you're doing it wrong. In the 1970s rock scene, two bands were masters of spectacle, Kiss and AC/DC. Both were famous for their wild live shows, but they came at it from completely different angles. For Kiss, the show was the whole point. The fire-breathing, the blood-spitting, the levitating drums, and the iconic makeup were just as important as the music. They were comic book heroes brought to life, a marketing machine that created a whole universe for their fans. For Angus Young, all of that was just a distraction. Angus's idea of stage presence was simple: the spectacle should come from the energy of the band, not from props. His schoolboy uniform was less a gimmick and more of a happy accident that just stuck, a visual that matched his frantic energy. The heart of an AC/DC show was always the music, the booming riffs, the pounding beat, and the band's raw, untamed power. When Angus looked at Kiss, he saw a band that had it all backwards. He openly mocked them for what he saw as a dependency on crazy stage antics to hide a lack of good music. His critique was sharp, calling Kiss a triumph of marketing over music. He figured if your songs were strong enough, you shouldn't need explosions and face paint. In his world, the real pyrotechnics came from the guitar, not from a guy with a lighter. It was a clash of authenticity versus performance. AC/DC were just 5 working-class guys who plugged in and played their guts out. There were no masks, literally or figuratively. What you saw was what you got. Kiss, on the other hand, was built on mystery and larger-than-life characters. They were the demon, the starchild, the spaceman, and the catman. To their fans, this was brilliant. To Angus, it was just silly that he couldn't get why a band would need to hide behind all that if their music could stand on its own. While AC/DC and Kiss both put on unforgettable shows, their approaches were polar opposites. AC/DC's power was in its raw, human energy. Kiss's power was in its superhuman, cartoonish spectacle. Angus saw that as a fundamental weakness, a sign that the music just wasn't the main event. Funnily enough, despite Angus's digs, the two bands toured together more than once, especially early on. It shows a certain level of professional respect, even if their philosophies were miles apart. While Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley were busy building an empire, Angus Young was building a legacy on a totally different foundation. He didn't need an army, he just needed a Gibson SG, a wall of marshals, and a crowd ready to rock. For Angus, that was always more than enough. Before we get to our next band, what do you think? Is rock about the raw music, like Angus believes, or does the spectacle and showmanship matter just as much? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're enjoying this trip through rock history, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss what's next. By the mid-70s, a new sound was shaking up rock music: punk. In London and New York, bands were stripping rock and roll down to its bones: 3 chords, a fast beat, and a snarling attitude. Leading the charge in America were the Ramones, 4 guys in leather jackets from Queens whose super-fast, minimalist anthems would inspire generations. They were hailed as rock saviors, a cure for the bloated prog rock of the time. Angus Young, however, was not impressed at all. His dismissal of the Ramones, and punk in general, is really telling. It shows his belief that real rock and roll needs more than just energy, it needs skill and craftsmanship. AC/DC's music is famously direct, but it's also incredibly tight and played with a level of skill that took years to perfect. Angus and Malcolm were masters of the groove, creating a rhythmic lock that was both simple and incredibly hard to copy. When Angus heard the Ramones, he didn't hear revolutionary simplicity, he heard amateurs. His famous quote on it is about as dismissive as it gets: "The Ramones, I only heard them once, I heard a song, and it did nothing. It seemed to me like the first band I was ever in, and I'm sure even that was better, and that was when I was 12. This wasn't just an insult, it was a total rejection of what punk stood for. Punk celebrated the idea that anyone could pick up a guitar and play, that passion mattered. Then technical skill. To Angus, that was a step backward. He grew up idolizing guitar players who were masters of their craft. He believed in a killer riff and a tight rhythm section. To him, punk was sacrificing musical quality for rebellion. He saw the Ramones as all style and no substance, criticizing the English punk scene in similar terms, saying, "They can go up there and do all that punk performance, but they can't play." This highlights a fascinating tension. Both AC/DC and the Ramones were about a back-to-basics approach, but their basics were totally different. For the Ramones, it was about stripping a song down to its skeleton. For AC/DC, it was about perfecting blues-based hard rock. Angus saw their simplicity as a weakness, a lack of skill dressed up as an artistic choice. He believed that to break the rules, you had to master them first. Ironically, the late Joey Ramone, the voice of the band Angus so easily dismissed, was a huge AC/DC fan and often called them one of his favorites. It's a classic one-way feud. For Angus, punk was a short-lived, musically bankrupt trend. For the punks who came after, AC/DC's stubborn commitment to loud, hard, and fast rock and roll was something to be admired, even if the feeling wasn't mutual. Angus Young's musical heroes say everything about his core values. He looks up to the pioneers, the innovators, the players who wrote the DNA of rock and roll guitar. At the very top of that list is Chuck Berry. To Angus, Berry was more than a guitarist, he was a showman, a songwriter, and the architect of the rock riff. His playing was raw, energetic, and full of a kind of reckless joy. It was everything Angus thought guitar playing should be. And that deep love for the raw power of the originators is the key to understanding his surprisingly sharp critique of another guitar legend. Eric Clapton. By any standard, Eric Clapton is one of the most respected guitarists ever. His work with the Yardbirds, Cream, and his solo career earned him the nickname God from his fans in the 60s. He's celebrated for his technical skill, his soulful playing, and his perfect blues style. But for Angus Young, Clapton's polished, revered style was missing the one thing that made his own heroes so great, the raw, untamed, and sometimes chaotic energy of pure rock and roll. Angus's critique of Clapton is summed up in one devastating comparison. He once joked that, even on a bad night, Chuck Berry was better than Clapton. That's not just a casual jab, it's a profound statement. It's not about who could play the most notes or who had the tastiest tone. It's about who better captured the wild spirit of the music. For Angus, Chuck Berry's playing, even with its mistakes and rough edges, was more exciting and more real than Clapton's more controlled and polished style. He saw a danger and an unpredictability in Berry's music that he felt was missing from Clapton's famous virtuosity. This points to a recurring theme in Angus's world: he prefers raw energy over technical perfection. He loves the players who sound like they might lose control at any second. This doesn't mean Angus denied Clapton's talent. He once acknowledged the influence that players like Clapton and Eddie Van Halen had on other guitarists. But he always followed that up with a key point: for him, rhythm was always more important than lead. He valued the power of the riff over the flash of the solo. In his mind, a guitarist's main job was to drive the song forward with an undeniable rhythmic force, something he felt the early rock and rollers did better than anyone. His take on Clapton, then, comes from a belief that Clapton's reputation was maybe a little overblown. He saw a guitarist celebrated for his technical skill but who, in Angus's opinion, lacked the raw, unfiltered grit of the true pioneers. It's a classic battle, the purist versus the virtuoso. While the world was calling Clapton God, Angus Young was still taking notes from the high priest of rock and roll, Chuck Berry. Of all the bands on this list, Angus Young's dislike for Deep Purple is by far the most personal, the most intense, and the most legendary. This wasn't just about music, this was a feud that was forged in the mud and anger of a disastrous music festival, a fight that went from professional disagreement to a literal, physical brawl. Musically, Angus's opinion of Deep Purple was already pretty low. He saw them as another example of the over-the-top, pretentious rock that he hated. Deep Purple, along with Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath, are often called the unholy trinity of early hard rock and heavy metal. But where many saw pioneers, Angus saw posers. He once paid his own money to see them live and left disgusted. "I saw Deep Purple live once and I paid money for it and I thought, geez, this is ridiculous," he remembered in an interview. His most cutting musical insult, though, was calling them a poor man's Led Zeppelin. Considering he wasn't a huge fan of Zeppelin to begin with, this was a particularly nasty takedown. He saw their mix of classical influences and virtuosic solos as the height of the self-indulgence he couldn't stand. "I never liked those Deep Purples or those sorts of things. I always hated it," he admitted, but this musical dislike blew up into open warfare in January 1975 at the Sunbury Pop Festival in Australia. AC/DC, still a young, hungry band on the way up, was scheduled to play. The headliners were Deep Purple, who were reportedly paid a massive $60,000 while most of the local acts got nothing. Tensions were already high. According to Angus, the trouble started when Deep Purple's roadies tried to stop AC/DC from going on stage, wanting to pack up their gear right away. What happened next is the stuff of rock legend. AC/DC's manager told his crew to set up their gear anyway, which led to a confrontation. Soon, punches were being thrown, and a full-on brawl broke out between the two bands' road crews. Angus remembered his brother, George Young, getting involved, and the late, great Bon Scott gleefully grabbing a roadie in a headlock, spinning him around while yelling, "Don't worry guys, I got him." Angus himself got on the mic and called for the crowd to help, leading to fans storming the stage to back up their local heroes. In the end, AC/DC never got to play. But the fight made front-page news, AC/DC in brawl with Deep Purple. As Angus later pointed out, the fight ironically did more for their reputation as tough, no-nonsense rockers than the actual show would have. It cemented their image as a working-class band that would literally fight for their right to play. Years later, the story softened. Deep Purple's singer at the time, David Coverdale, eventually became friends with the AC/DC guys and said they all laughed about it. But in that moment, at that festival, the clash was very real. It was a perfect storm of musical dislike and personal conflict. A symbolic battle between a raw, up-and-coming band and an established act that, in Angus's eyes, had gotten too big for its boots. When you look back at Angus Young's sharpest critiques, a clear picture comes into view. It's not a picture of a bitter or angry man, but of a rock and roll purist with a belief system made of granite. His targets, whether it was the Stones chasing trends, Zeppelin's self-indulgence, Kiss's theatrics, the Ramones' amateurism, or the personal and musical insult of Deep Purple, all broke his one commandment: rock and roll must be honest, powerful, and direct. For over 50 years, AC/DC has been the unwavering North Star of pure, high-voltage rock. They never bent to trends, they never overcomplicated their message, and they never pretended to be anything other than exactly what they are. Angus Young's famous criticisms aren't just insults, they are the verbal version of his guitar playing, sharp, to the point, and unapologetically loud. They're the sound of a man who knows exactly what he stands for and has never been afraid to defend his turf. In a world of changing fashions and fleeting fame, Angus Young is still the ultimate true believer. And for that, we salute him.